With the 2024 season all wrapped up and all us F1 fans twiddling our thumbs, waiting for the new season to begin, I decided to investigate how Ferrari were so close to winning another championship, but ended in heartbreak yet again. And yes, I'm fine. No need to send help. 100% sure. With all the jokes aside, Ferrari ended the season with just 14 points adrift of the first place McLaren. If Sainz had finished first and Norris second instead of the other way around in Abu Dhabi, Ferrari would have been champions. That's how close it was. But that was just one race, and the season is long. So let's take a zoomed out view of the season points for Ferrari versus McLaren. This is a graph of the cumulative points scored across the season in each race by both Ferrari and McLaren. Ferrari actually started out the season really well before having a mid-season dip and then catching right back up to McLaren towards the end of the season. But there are 4 critical races in the season that led to their downfall. But the common theme across these races, bar one, is DNFs. And that's what we're going to look at next. As you can see, McLaren only had 1 DNF, whereas Ferrari had 4. And I think that was one of the significant factors that swung the championship from Ferrari towards McLaren. And just for fun, I decided to put Williams on this chart as well. And they had 12 DNFs. Let me remind you, there are 24 total races in the season, and Williams had 12. Yikes. Let's look at the first of the 4 critical races, the Canadian Grand Prix. Ferrari started the weekend with high hopes of being competitive, and this was justified based on the car's strength in low-speed corners. All of Sector 3 is low speed, and Turn 2 of Sector 1 is also low speed, which builds up to the rest of the sector. So looking at the Canadian Grand Prix track map, their optimism was justified. But coming into FP3, they realized the balance of the car was just not right, and they weren't getting any temperature in their tires. And all of this made them realize that the weekend was going to be a tough one. And in qualifying, they got knocked out in Q2. Even if they maximized everything, they would have ended up maybe P9 or P10. So let's look at the race and dive deeper into the data to see if Ferrari could have done something different. So this is a race plot of the gap of each driver per lap to the average lap time of the race winner. And so on the x-axis, you can see the number of laps, which is 70 for Canada. And then on the y-axis, you can see the gap in seconds. So as each lap goes by, the gap to the race winner's average lap time is calculated for each driver. And this is a good way to look at what were some of the opportunities that a particular driver might have utilized, or some opportunities that a particular driver might have lost. And you can kind of look back and see in hindsight what the teams could have done differently to figure out the best race strategy. So let's look at Ferrari over here. Ferrari, because they started out so far out, they were already quite behind from the get-go. And because they had no pace, you can see that their gap just increases to the race leaders. But as the track dried up, they decided to maybe take the gamble. Because they had no speed whatsoever, they're like, might as well. And so they put Leclerc on the hard tires. But unfortunately, that drive spell was only momentary, and it started raining again. And that plummeted Leclerc all the way back over there, and he was losing so much time that at one point, he was almost 100 seconds behind just Carlos. And so it was basically doomed. You know what this reminds me? You know how I feel when I look at this? P-A-I-N. Pain. They retired the car at lap 40, and I was devastated. It just hurt me so bad. But then, everything is not lost. Let's look at Sainz. Sainz is still in the race. He had a pretty uneventful race so far, until he decided to spin out and crash. And so his race ended here. And that's where Ferrari lost both their cars and scored 0 points in Canada, and it was awful. But if you look at the race plot closely, around lap 47, right here, you can see that Sainz actually overtakes Ricciardo. Ricciardo is in the dark blue over here. And Ricciardo actually goes on to finish the race P8. So if Sainz had like overtaken him and kept that position and kept going, he probably would have finished P8 and gained 4 points. Obviously, this safety car period over here was caused by Sainz's crash, and that caused a lot of chaos. But you never know, if Sainz had kept that, he might have been on course for a P8 finish, which would have been amazing. Moving on to the next crucial race, the Austrian Grand Prix. With Max and Lando colliding, and Lando DNFing, Ferrari had a really good opportunity to maximize their points relative to McLaren. Unfortunately, Leclerc collected damage on the first lap and had to pit for a new front wing, and eventually finished 11th. But if we look at the data, I think Ferrari could have maximized Leclerc's race and gotten him even to maybe 8th or 9th. So let's dive into the data and let's look at the race plot. As you can see over here, Leclerc had his accident and had to pit immediately. So he's all the way back over here, dead last at the end of lap 2. So now he has to claw back all of that distance. But if you look at the relative pit stops compared to the rest of the grid, he did 1, 2, and 3. 3 pit stops compared to the rest of the grid's only 2 pit stops. And the average time lost during a pit stop is about 22 seconds. And so Leclerc, by taking that additional pit stop, now not only has to recover that additional 22 seconds that he lost, but he has to make up ground that he lost initially up here to be competitive. So with that, he had to basically have a super aggressive race strategy and cut in to all of his deficits with his pit stops. And starting off, he does it really well. He's actually making good progress, but only until the very end. Like, that's when he starts making enough progress that he's able to like overcome the entire time lost by this entire pit stop. So this is the only time when he's actually able to make some ground. Everywhere else, he's like losing time. He loses so much time over here. So what else could he have done? So if you look at Perez over here in the dotted blue, he actually goes for a super long middle stint. So he does a decent first stint, similar to what the other race leaders do. Pits a little earlier, but then goes super long for the middle stint. And this is kind of the race trajectory that I was expecting Ferrari to implement for Leclerc, where you're just maintaining the gap. You're not really racing the tires hard. You're not degrading them. You're just maintaining it and maintaining that gap. So you can see that it's relatively flat. And that's what I was expecting Ferrari to do with Leclerc. Go super long on this stint, right after the first pit stop, similar to what Perez did. Save the tires, and then keep a constant gap. Try not to race the tires too hard or degrade them. And instead of pitting over here, you make your second pit stop right over here. And now already you can kind of see that once you make your pit stop over here and you follow the same trajectory that you would have done over here with your 4-stop strategy, you would have already been ahead of Ricciardo. And then even here, once you get up to this stop, now you can like start aggressively getting back and cutting into that deficit. And by that time, you're almost right there. You're right in the mix with Ricciardo, and you would be fighting for that 8th or 9th place. And so obviously this is a little idealistic. Maybe you actually lose some time. Maybe instead of going flat over here, you probably lose some time. And then you're losing time there with the pit stop, and then you might not be able to recover that much time that you lost from the pit stop, and you're still maybe like far behind Ricciardo. That is a possibility. But if you look at the math, the average time lost during a pit stop is about 22 seconds. And then Leclerc, right here, when he finishes with this four-star strategy, is about 6 seconds, I'd say. Yeah, 61, and then he's at like 67, 6 seconds. So he finishes 6 seconds behind. And so even if you didn't take that additional pit stop and you go slower than you would have gone, and you lose 11 seconds due to saving your tires, you're still a net 11 seconds up ahead on the road compared to where you are right now at the end of the race. You finish 7 seconds behind and you actually gain 11 seconds by not taking that pit stop. You're ahead of Ricciardo, possibly even fighting Magnussen. Maybe you lose some time with the battle, but you're still ahead, or you're in the mix of fighting for points. And so he could have scored at least 4 or maybe 2 points. So that was another missed opportunity. For the third race, the Singapore Grand Prix, both Ferrari and McLaren didn't necessarily have a DNF that would impact their results, but Ferrari did make crucial mistakes during qualifying that impacted their race. So Ferrari started in 9th and 10th, and that was because Sainz crashed out in Q2 and wasn't able to set a time for Q3. And Leclerc set a time for Q3 but got deleted because of track limits. And you can see they already have a gap to the leaders from the get-go. And because they were stuck behind slower moving cars, for example, Hülkenberg and Perez, they lost a lot of time in the first stint. You can see over here, both Lando and Verstappen were pulling away from the rest of the field. And because the Ferraris were stuck behind the slower moving cars, they were almost a pit stop away to Max by the time it was almost 20-25 laps. And so they had to go for an aggressive strategy to try to pass some of the cars because overtaking is really hard in Singapore. So they had to rely on strategic advantage to try to claw back the distance. So what Ferrari did was they split the strategy. They made Sainz pit early, so that's why you have this peak over here. And then they decided for Leclerc to go long. So he went all the way till here, to lap 35. And as you can see, immediately after Hülkenberg pits, Leclerc is set free. But by the time he'd lost so much time behind Hülkenberg and used up quite a bit of the tires with the close proximity of following him, that he didn't make that much inroad. But he was just trying to eke it out, so once he does pit, he has fresher tires and he can go on the attack. On the other hand, Sainz, by pitting early, gets into fresh air and is able to eke out his tires, manage them, and keep a steady pace. But because he pitted so far early, almost lap 13, he has a long way to go. And so he's basically in tire conservation mode. And so he basically just finishes the best that he can with the tires that he has. He does get ahead of Perez because of that free air in this stint, so it was a positive, but that was the maximum he could do. And Leclerc, by going long in the first stint, was able to go super aggressive on the second stint and cut almost all of the deficit to Russell. And he almost would have overtaken him if it wasn't for, Singapore, where it's one of the hardest tracks to overtake. And he probably was losing quite a bit of tire life towards the end. But that was like a really good comeback. As you can see, he had a really aggressive tire advantage. And so Charles and Sainz finish 5th and 7th respectively by the end of the race, and it was basically damage limitation. But instead, if they didn't make any mistakes in qualifying and started further up, even if they started, let's say, 6th and 7th behind all of the front runners, I think they could have, with the pace that they had, they could have finished at least 4th or 5th. Like if Charles was able to go this fast with this kind of an aggressive strategy, and Sainz was able to manage the second stint and still finish ahead of Perez, I think they had enough pace to at least overtake a couple of cars, whether on track or just with strategy alone. So they could have finished 4th and 5th and scored an additional 6 points compared to where they are right now, which was 5th and 7th. So that would have made a huge difference. And I say this because if you look at all of these 3 races and tally up the additional points that Ferrari could have scored by maximizing everything, they could have been world champions. And the reason that is because Canada, they could have earned 4 additional points. Austria, they could have scored another 4 additional points. Singapore, they could have scored an additional 6 points. Now, if you tally up all of that, is it's 14 points, and that is exactly the deficit that Ferrari had to McLaren after Abu Dhabi. So with these additional points, they could have won the World Championship or Constructors Championship. It was that close. They just had to make these minor adjustments and they would have won. But the most impactful race of all was the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. If this didn't happen and Sainz goes on to finish the race, and let's be conservative, let's assume Perez overtakes Sainz, he gets P3, Sainz gets P4, but crucially, he finishes the race. But even more importantly, that means Norris finishes 2 places behind. So Sainz nets 12 additional points for getting 4th, and Norris loses 4 points for finishing 2 places lower. Now, Ferrari were 14 points behind McLaren. By losing those 4 additional points and Sainz getting 12 points, that's a net benefit for Ferrari, and they would have won the championship. And that's why it was so painful. But here we are, trying to win it for another year after another year of waiting. But hopefully these guys can do it.